Hi, welcome to CoMotion Labs Fundamentals for Startups. I am Yuli Rivera. I'm the CoMotion Labs Life Science Manager. We're excited for you to join us for a new slate of speakers and can't wait to see you all in person soon. While we wait for everyone to log in to this event, I'll make a few announcements. Next week, Cassie Binford and Matt Medlin, CPAs and leaders of Clark Newber's team, serving pre-seed, angel and venture-backed companies, will present roadmap to scale financial reporting. All of our fundamentals for startup presentations are archived on our CoMotion website under innovation training videos. We have covered a variety of topics over the past several years, so if you find yourself with some free time, check out our past talks. For our full schedule and to register for future fundamentals, please visit our CoMotion Fundamentals website event site. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the notification bell. You will be then notified of all future live streams. Fundamentals for Startups is funded in part by a grant from the Economic Development Agencies. We will be dropping a link into the chat for a short survey. Please tell us who you are, where you're watching, and how you heard about this event. This will help us report back to continue the funding. We do greatly appreciate your participation in that survey. This year, we are proud to partner with Bluetooth to support the Fundamentals for Startups program. See how Bluetooth audio sharing is poised to once again change the way you will experience audio and connect with the world around you.
Bluetooth introduced the world to wireless audio. Calling, listening, watching, making us safer, more productive, more joyful. It's part of the fabric of our lives. Now, Bluetooth will bring us even closer to each other and our world with audio sharing. It will let us share with others our music, our experiences, listening and watching together. The places we go will share with us, enriching our experiences, helping us hear our world. Breaking down barriers between interests, cultures, generations. Introducing Bluetooth audio sharing. Closer together.
Today, Alex Salazar is here to present how to find your first 5 customers. Alex Salazar, partner at NeoTribe Ventures, is the rare combination of founder, engineer, and early-stage go-to-market expert. Before becoming a venture capitalist, he was the founder CEO of Stormpath, acquired by Okta, where he built an authentication API service for developers and grew a bottoms-up model that attracted thousands of developers every week. At Okta, as VP/GM of new products, Alex introduced a new IT product and scaled it from $0 to $9 million in sales in under 4 quarters. Alex holds a BS in computer science from Georgia Tech and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Alex loves any excuse to get into the water and to surf the breaks in Capitola. Alex will take all questions via chat. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. And I will now turn the event over to Alex.
All right, thank you. Hey, everybody. So, when we work with founders, one of the biggest challenges that all early stage founders run into when they're building companies that have to sell to other organizations is how do you get those very, very first customers? And it's a particularly vexing problem because the company's so early, the product's so early, and the company's not yet ready to hire a salesperson, that ultimately the founders are the ones trying to drive these initial sales efforts. And so we often give a presentation to our founders that I'm going to share now with you on how to drive those first 5 customer sales before you have any kind of salespeople on staff. And so, there we go. So a little bit about NeoTribe Ventures, very, very quickly. We are an early stage venture firm, and we invest in audacious breakthrough technologies. We're a classic deep tech venture firm. And what sets us apart from most other venture firms is that we're entrepreneurs at heart. 2/3 of the partnership are former founder CEOs who've had successful exits and built great businesses. And we take what we learned to help inform you as you become the founders you want to be. So without further ado, let's talk about early stage sales. One of the things that makes early stage sales so difficult is that it's not just you trying to sell a product to a customer. What's happening at the same time is that you're really going through what people refer to as a customer discovery process. You're trying to sell while at the same time you're trying to learn from these prospective customers about the problems that they have, the alternative solutions that they're exploring or they already have in place, and what it would take for your product to be valuable to them to the point where they wouldn't just buy it, but they take the risk on a very early stage product. And so because of this complexity, I firmly believe that early stage sales is something that only a founder can really do. It's very, very difficult to go hire a traditional salesperson to do this because they're really only experienced in doing sales. Conversely, a product manager might be very good at doing customer discovery, but they typically have no experience doing sales. And so a founder typically has a broad enough view where they can synthesize both of these challenges and drive both of them through one set of conversations with customers. And I'm going to walk you through how to do that. So we're talking about three things. The first is just understanding how customers buy, in particular organizations. That this also applies to consumers as well. The second is, how do you reach out to customers? How do you get those meetings? In particular, when you don't have a very big network already. And then once you get those meetings, how do you prosecute that first call in order to find out if this is somebody that's going to be a potential customer for you or not? So let's talk about how customers buy. One of the hardest things for early stage founders to wrap their heads around typically is this difference between customers needing your product and customers having what's called an active need, right? A need is when someone has a problem. You see it, you totally get that they have a problem. But an active need is where the customer wants to do something about that problem. It's not just that it's a problem, it's that it's a high priority problem. And as founders, it's not good enough to just be solving a problem. You have to solve a high priority problem. Otherwise, the customers won't move anywhere near as fast as they need to in order for you to get your company off the ground and survive. And so what you'll see in our conversation, in particular in the later stages, a pretty myopic focus on trying to extract that priority information out of the customer. Is this something that they want to move on? And is something that they're willing to spend their time and money on now? And if you think of any product that you've purchased, in the last year, most people go through a pretty straightforward buying process. And it's really important for you as, a potential salesperson or a founder to understand these purchase processes, because it's going to help you align your sales processes to meet the customer where they are. And so I'll give you a really good example. You're buying a pair of shoes. Most people don't just typically go online and hit a button and buy a pair of shoes. There's typically a bit more thought to that. You probably saw an ad, on Instagram, and you're like, oh, that's a nice pair of shoes. And then it immediately got you thinking about potentially buying a pair of shoes. And then maybe you stopped and thought, well, do I need a pair of shoes? Do I need a pair of high tops? Do I need a pair of running shoes? Do I need a pair of hiking shoes? Do I need sandals? So you thought about what kind of shoes you might actually need. And then you ultimately decide, I do need a new pair of running shoes. And because my old ones are kind of getting old and ratty, they don't look good anymore. And so once you decide that you want this new pair of running shoes, then you go online and you start searching. Okay, what are the different running shoes that are out there that I would like, that are in my size, that are for the kind of trail running I might be doing, and that I like. And so eventually you're going to look online and you're going to bring it down to a small set of pair of shoes. One from Nike, one from New Balance, one from Adidas. And then you might try some of them on. You might order some from Zappos, put them on, take them for a spin, see if you like them. And then you're going to decide on which one you like. You're going to make a purchase decision, and then you're going to pay Zappos or Amazon, whoever else you're buying these shoes from. This process is not dissimilar from how a large organization like Starbucks might buy $1 million worth of enterprise software. Conversely, as a salesperson, if you're trying to close a customer and get them to pay you when they're still in the needs recognition process, when they're still figuring out what they really need, you're going to make the customer upset and they're not going to want to work with you. Conversely, if you're trying to explain to the customer what they should really be considering as they're looking through buying your product, but they're already, evaluating the alternatives, you're not meeting them where they are, and you might be pitching the wrong things at the right time. What's also important about selling to organizations in particular is that it's typically not one person's decision to buy something. Within an organization, there are typically buying units. There's the CEO who may have final approval on any decision. There's the software architect who is the person who's going to make the recommendation. There's the head of marketing for whom it's coming out of their budget. Then there's all the different people who might be using the particular system, and they don't really have a say, but if they can't make it work, you might have a problem after the sale. And so in any organization sale, it's really important to understand who all the different people are in this purchase decision and make sure that you've got a plan around how you're going to manage those individual stakeholders and to what degree you're going to meet with them and talk to them. But the most important thing to understand in an organization is that there almost always needs to be somebody in the organization that salespeople call your champion. This is the person who feels the pain so acutely, for whom it's such a high priority, and they're so excited about what you are building or delivering that they're going to be selling for you internally when you're not in the room. And so part of what we're going to talk about today around sourcing people to talk to, how to have these conversations, it's all really focused on finding the champion first and then having all these conversations I'm going to talk about. So for any product you're thinking of building for an organization, step one is really think through, who might this champion be? Is it a software architect? Is it a chief scientist? Is it the CEO? Is it somebody else? And then once you have a sense of who might feel this most acutely, that's the person that we're going to target with everything else we're going to talk about. So once we have a sense of who we want to target, we got to go build an outreach plan. So for the sake of argument, we're going to reach out to, the chief technology officer at, certain types of organizations. That's going to be our typical champion for this example. Okay, how do we go find these people? How do we go get meetings? How do we build that outreach plan? Well, the first thing is you need to come up with a message. The message you're going to take to these people. Now, this is a bit of product marketing, but I would urge everybody to have 3 foundational messages. The first one is very straightforward, a one-liner. What does your product do? This is a really important thing that you're going to use everywhere, but you need to get this down to a one-liner and ideally without any jargon. And then the second thing is LinkedIn is very, very powerful for outreach. And so, but LinkedIn typically has a character limit on what your connection messages can say. So get a message that's 2 to 3 quick lines that's going to try and get someone to meet with you. And then separate from LinkedIn, you should also have a longer form email message that you're going to email people directly with if you're not getting responses or can't get through to them on LinkedIn. So I'll give you an example of these. So what does your product do? Now, these are real world examples. These are, in fact, 3 real world examples that I've worked on myself individually. So Cobbler, in particular Cobbler.io, automates budget variance analysis. This is a product for finance people in organizations. The product that I worked on before I left Okta is the Okta Access Gateway, extends single sign-on and multi-factor authentication to on-premise applications. And then my old company, with Stormpath gives your developers out-of-the-box authentication and user management. So what's that simplified version message of what your product's going to be? Try and keep it simple. Try and keep it very clear. Pro tip, I would avoid the word platform. If the word platform is making its way into this document, you should go back and rethink. Then when it comes to LinkedIn message, there's a few different ways of going about it. Here are two different approaches. The first one is a more direct approach about the product and the value proposition that it's going to have and trying to get a meeting. The second one is one I actually used, which is more about trying to get them to do you a favor. Working some sort of personal angle like you're a student and trying to get people to just give you time for that reason. In both scenarios, you'll notice they're asking for feedback. They're not asking to have a sales call. They're not saying that I want to pitch you. They're not asking the customer to buy anything. It's simply asking the customer to spend some time with you and share feedback on the product. This is purposeful for this stage of any startup. Because this is not just sales, you're also doing customer discovery. You want to position the meeting as a feedback session because you're actually going to run it in large part like a feedback session for you to learn what it might take for this customer to get excited and potentially buy. And then more broadly, you're going to hit a lot of people over email. Now, email, you have a bit more room to write out stuff. And so same concept in this example, again, working the personal angle. Hey, I'm a recent student. I'm working on this thing. Given your experience, can you please meet with me and give some feedback? Now, this is actually copy and pasted the message that I personally used to outbound the global CIO of Boeing. And it worked. They became my first customer. So this is a real world example. This has not been edited. One other thing I'll add to this message that was not in the LinkedIn one is because you have a little bit more space, you can provide a little bit more color on trying to schedule a meeting. You can say, hey, are you willing to meet in the coming weeks? Here's some availability. Can you meet on Tuesday? Can you meet on Wednesday? I'll follow up next week to see if these times work. Here's another example, again, from this company called Cobbler. Again, this is more product value proposition led as opposed to do me a favor kind of thing, but similar concept. And if you look at the structures, they're almost identical. We're just delivering slightly different messages to try and get you to bite. So once you have these messages, it's time to go execute. And the first thing to do is to go build a list. Okay, so how do you build a list? Well, LinkedIn's a great place to build a list. Now, there are many products out there, but since you're probably not a professional salesperson and you don't yet have a sales team, the beauty of LinkedIn Sales Navigator is that it's relatively inexpensive and you can just self-serve your way into it without having to talk to a salesperson and buy a number of seats for your organization. You can just go on, hit a credit card and go. It's not cheap. I think it's about $100 a month, but it's a fantastic tool to start with. And what you can do is once you have a sense of who these champions might be and what industries they might be in, what geographies they might be in, what size of company they might be in, maybe what technologies they're already working with, what titles or seniority, you can go into LinkedIn Sales Navigator. You can populate a filter criteria based on everything you believe. And that'll give you a long list of people. And then you can just start adding them to a list. My advice is to start with a list of 50. Don't boil the ocean, just start with 50. And then what'll happen is as you make progress, as people give you meetings or people tell you to leave them alone or people don't respond, you'll start to cycle out those 50 for more and more people. You don't want a list that's too short because then you won't get as many results as you want. But you also don't want a list that's too long because then you might get overwhelmed. And this work, frankly, can be overwhelming if you're not used to it. Which actually is a great segue into, now that you've got the list, let's execute the plan. So you've got this initial list of 50. You got to go through each of them, spend some time, look at their backgrounds, go to their websites, get some sense of who they are and what companies they're working with, and try and get a sense of, how you personalize this message that we're sending for each target so that you increase the odds of them responding and decrease the odds of them feeling like it's just a canned message that a million other people got. They're more likely to respond if they feel it's really for them. And then probably the hardest part, but probably the most impactful, is you have to dedicate time for outreach. This work sucks. I don't know anyone who likes doing it. Even the best salespeople I know hate this work. But you got to do it. And dedicating 4 hours to actually doing the outreach, not the research, not the list building, but the actual sending of the messages and follow up and phone calls and doing anything that it takes to go get that meeting, you want to allocate that time. And my advice is to allocate it as one block, because it'll be easier for you to knock it out as opposed to like half hour here, half hour there, half hour here. Now, in addition to sending out your own messages via LinkedIn and email, you should also leverage a bunch of other resources that you might have. You might have a personal network, your friends, your friends' friends, your family's friends. If you have investors, for sure your investors. And then one of the things that people underestimate is the power of simply calling somebody. If you can get someone's phone number, you'll be very surprised how effective it is to have a follow-up phone call after you've sent somebody an email a few times. It still works, even though people think it doesn't. And it's very unlikely that anyone's going to respond on the first email. And so part of the game is following up. First email might get ignored, might not get seen. It's not a high priority for the person anyways. So even if they're interested, they might say, oh, I'll get back to them later. But when you follow up a second time, they're like, oh yeah, I meant to go respond to this person. Oh, okay, I'm going to read this message for real now. I may or may not take a meeting. And then if they still don't get back to you, ping them again and again. And I would say, I would email them maybe 3 or 4 times over the course of a few weeks. And by that time, most people will respond one way or the other. And after a few weeks, if a person hasn't responded at all, you should drop them from the list. And if someone tells you, of course, that they're not interested, you drop them from the list. Now, again, this work is really hard. And so I urge you to find a way of rewarding yourself. Now, this isn't me just being touchy-feely. If you ever walk into a large organization's sales floor, back when salespeople were all inside of a building pre-COVID, this is actually what sales managers spend a lot of time and energy on. If you sit on a sales floor long enough, there's a lot of reward behavior happening. There are leaderboards. There people are ringing bells. During weekly calls, sales managers are calling out the successes that different reps have had. There's a method to that madness. It is because this work can be so challenging. You really want to celebrate not just the activity, but also the successes. And so if you get a meeting, throw a parade. If you got through the 4 hours, go play a video game or something, or go buy yourself a cupcake, whatever it takes. And to the degree that you can, try and gamify it for yourself so that you're incented to come back next week and the week after and continue working on this work. Now, prospecting, which is what we're ultimately talking about, is a very big topic. And I just kind of given you the primer. I do think this is enough to get going. But if you are interested in being great at this, there's a book that I recommend to salespeople called Fanatical Prospecting. It's actually one of the few sales books that I think is accurate. Not the best written book, but it's a very, very good book with good points. And so I recommend people read it. I give it to my founders and I recommend it to salespeople. Okay, so this is the hard part. You send out 50 emails. You send out 40 follow-ups. A few weeks go by, you end up getting 3 to 5 meetings. You're now scheduled to go talk to somebody that you weren't prepared to talk to. You're going to go talk to the global CIO of Boeing, or you're going to go talk to, some vice president of technology at Amazon. How do you handle that meeting? What do you do? And how do you make that meeting productive so that you're both learning what you need to learn as part of your product discovery process, but also positioning yourself for sales in the event that there might be a fit for your product? And then most importantly, how do you make that time, be a good reflection of you so you look professional and not a waste of that person's time? So a lot of it starts before the meeting. So when I started my career, I was a software engineer who accidentally ended up in sales and loved it. And I worked at IBM for a few years, and IBM had fantastic sales training. And one of the things that they used to tell us was, if you fail to prepare, you should prepare to fail. And the whole point was, before any meeting, do the work. And these are the 3 pieces of work that every salesperson and every founder should do before one of these calls. First one is research who you are going to meet with. Learn about them, learn about their company, read some press releases. If you have time, go look at their 10 Qs and 10 Ks that they have published on the SEC website. Go read anything you can about this person and their company and their industry, so you have context. And maybe that might give you a few talking points where you can be a little bit more specific in your questions or your messages that are related to them. So I'll give you a good example. Maybe you're selling networking technology, and you just found out there's a big press release that this company is opening up a second branch office. Amazon, for example. Amazon just opened a massive office in Virginia. Right? Okay, well, great. Now, if you're going to go talk about networking technology, you might want to bring up the fact, hey, Mr. Customer, how are you thinking about wiring up this new Amazon office? So things like that. Once you have done this work, you'll have a lot more context, and it'll be easier for you to set what the objective is for the call. What is it that you want to get out of this phone call? That way you can ensure that you don't end up on some monologue, or you don't get caught in some tangent that the customer might take you down. And the last thing here is, you want to visualize how the call might go, and you want to think through what are some of the objections or challenges that the customer might throw at you. Really easy examples are, oh, this is really expensive, right? Or, oh, this is a cloud service. Well, we don't trust, cloud services for this kind of information. Like, whatever you think a customer might kind of, have a problem with, or ask you more questions about, think through them, and then think through how you might respond to them, so that when you get these questions, you're not caught flat-footed. In fact, there was a research study, I think out of Harvard, maybe a decade ago, which tried to separate what made good sales reps different from great sales reps. And what they found was, one of the biggest differences was that great sales reps were far and away better at handling objections than the good sales reps. So this is part of how they do that. So normally we do a little bit of a workshop break here, but in the context of this meeting, I'll just walk you through the customer discovery framework that I typically use to manage these conversations. So the first is, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at the Steve Blank's writings. There's this great professor out of Berkeley who's a former entrepreneur. His name's Steve Blank. He wrote, I thought, one of the best startup books out there called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And he lays out a framework for doing customer discovery. And I like using this framework in these sales calls because they do double duty. They'll help you understand more about the customer and figuring out if you have product market fit. And if the answers are all very enthusiastic from the customer, that's a signal that you have a live sales opportunity. So the first part of this framework is making sure that you understand the customer's problems. Now, if you were a professional salesperson working with an at-scale product, if you are an AWS sales rep trying to sell me EC2, you would handle this call very, very differently. But at the stage that most of you are likely to be at the early stage, I like to start with your understanding of what the customer problems are. You've been thinking about this product and this problem for months or maybe years. You have a hypothesis on what the customer's problems are. Lay them out. Hey, Mr. Customer, I think you have these 3 problems. 1, 2, 3. What do you think? Am I getting it right? Do you actually have these problems? Have I missed something? Am I misunderstanding? Or one of these just not an issue at all? Get the customer talking. Now, the power of starting this way, as opposed to how a normal rep might try and start. A normal rep might say, hey, Mr. Customer, what are your initiatives for the year? Hey, Mr. Customer, what are you struggling with now? What keeps you up at night? They start asking the customer the problem statements and then let the customer talk free form. That's great for professional sales. But at this stage, it's not great because you don't have the direct opportunity to test your hypothesis. So start with your hypothesis and then get them talking. And you'll find out for the first few of these customer conversations, maybe the first 10 customers you talk to, you're going to find out that you were probably pretty wrong. First 10, you're going to find out that problem 1 isn't really an issue. Problem 2 is interesting, but not a high priority. And it turns out it's all about problem 3. Oh, and by the way, you totally missed problem 4. And so that's huge because then when you start talking to customer 11, 12, and 13, you're more dialed into what the problems really are. And if you talk to like 50 or 60 customers in this process, by the end, you're very dialed into the problem statement. And it'll be rare for someone to tell you that this isn't actually a problem because you'll be so in touch with what the market is feeling. So you have this conversation, customer tells you you're right, you're wrong, you learn a bunch, you ask a ton of questions, you get very curious. My pro tip is every time someone tells you they have a problem or agrees to it, try and quantify it. Hey, I've got this big problem. I don't have enough developers to build my own login system fast enough. Okay, well, Mr. Customer, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because I've got these product managers and business units that are pushing me to get this customer-facing application out the door. Okay, well, why is that a problem for them? Oh, because they're revenue generating. Okay, great. If you got this application out a month or 2 or 3 earlier, how much revenue do the business teams think they could get? Oh, well, I don't really know, but my guess is they could probably get like an extra $1 million a year or whatever it is the quantification might be. It's very hard to do, and not every customer can think that crisply, but if you can get them down to a quantification of the problem, that's gold. Once you get the customer to explain their problem, then you want to go back and challenge them with what are the alternative solutions? Okay, Mr. Customer, your developers are spending all this time on authentication. They don't know how to build authentication. They don't have enough bandwidth. You want to get it out faster. You want to get it more secure. Well, let me walk you through what I think your alternatives are. Your alternative 1 today is that you're custom building it yourself. And the customer is like, yes, that's how we're doing it. Alternative number 2 is, you're using a solution like Auth0 or Okta. And, alternative number 3 is maybe, I don't know, you're outsourcing it to a professional consulting firm. And, and so whatever these alternatives are to your product, lay them all out. Don't be afraid of putting up your direct competitors, because what you want to do here is you really want to challenge the customer to explain to you why these alternative solutions work or don't work for them. And at this stage of a startup, it is just as valuable for a customer to tell you that a solution is awesome and does everything they need and there's no reason they'd buy anything else than it is for them to tell you that they're super excited because there's no solution on the market and they want to buy your product. So if you were building an authentication as a service product and the customer, waxes poetically on how great Auth0 is, that's a good signal that, maybe you need to rethink your product. But anyways, regardless, really validate with customers what they're considering alternatives are, what they're implementing today, what they're considering implementing, and what the shortfalls might be, and or why they like those solutions. And then lastly, you start talking about your product. This is really important. If you look at the structure, 2/3 of the meeting is them talking about what they're experiencing. The last third is about your product. This is purposeful. So here you're going to say, hey, Mr. Customer, let me tell you about my solution. I can do X, Y, and Z. I'm an authentication as a service product. I'm going to give you an out-of-the-box login screen that's customizable. I'm going to give you out-of-the-box workflows for password reset. And I'm going to have all the security you would expect out of the box so that nobody's stealing passwords or user identities. Mr. Customer, how valuable are these to you? How high of a priority are these for you? Get them talking to see what matters. They, again, similar to the last two, they may be very excited about feature 1 and 2 and not care at all about feature 3. They might be excited about all 3. They might be excited about none of it. This is also a great opportunity for you to test. Well, okay, you're not excited about 1 and 2. What if we did 4? This other idea, would that be valuable? And so you get to learn a lot as part of the discovery process. So far in this conversation, this has really just been about customer discovery. And this is where I think it's very important to ask what I think is the critical question in a customer discovery process, which is, would you pay me for this? So customer tells you everything you're doing is right. You identified the problem, you understand why all the alternatives suck, and your feature set looks amazing, right? Great, Mr. Customer. Would you pay me $1 million? And see what they say. Now, do you ask if they'd pay you $1 million? That's up to you. But my recommendation is to throw out a very big number. Whatever you think is a number at the edge of reason. Not a crazy number, but one that's like close to crazy. Because what you want is you want them to say no. But you don't want them to laugh you out of the room. Because when they say no, then you can ask the real question, which is, what price would make sense? And then as they start talking about how they would think about price, you should be taking notes like crazy and asking them to explore this, because now you're really getting an insight into the economic value that the customer is going to experience. This is huge. Now, if someone tells you, hey, I would pay you for this. Yes. Would I pay you $1 million? No, but I might pay you 50K. I might pay you 20K. I might pay you 100K. At that point, that's when you flip to sales. If someone's telling you they would pay you, now you have a live opportunity for sales. And I'll talk more about what to do next if that happens. What will happen initially a lot, and if you don't have product market fit, what will happen a lot more is people will tell you that they don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not the executive. I don't have the budget. I'm not in charge of figuring out how much to pay. I don't know. If you get that question, the follow-up question is, okay. I know you don't know how much you would pay. I get that. What if it were free? If my product were free, would you implement it tomorrow? And I'll tell you, you'll be blown away by how many people are going to tell you no. And this is important because one of the important things about selling to an organization is that it is very expensive for them to do anything, to implement new technologies, integration efforts. There's training, there's changes of processes. These things are expensive, and in many cases, they cost more than the software or the technology that you might be selling. And so kind of testing this opposite boundary is going to uncover all of these challenges that someone might be worried about in terms of using your solution. And if they're not interested in implementing it, even if it were free, you just got a very high quality signal that you don't yet have a high value product, at least for this customer. So what happens next? You went through this call, you went through customer discovery. Hopefully you learned a lot or validated a lot about the problem the customers are having, the alternative solutions, their interest and priority for your feature set, and whether or not this customer is interested in buying your product at all. So what you do next really depends on how that call went. You've got to read the room. You've got to get a sense of how this thing went. And so if you think this is a dead end, they told you flat out, hey, you know what, I'm not interested. We would never buy this. or, I wouldn't implement it for free, but it's interesting. If it's a dead end, thank them for their time. Be very gracious. Hey, thank you for your time. This has been a great meeting. I learned a lot, and then ask them for introductions to other people. Bring this back to your outreach process. Hey, I know this isn't a fit for you, but do you recommend we talk to anybody else? Are there any other software architects that you think I might get really good feedback from? And then see if they'll make introductions. Again, you're probably not going to get a super high hit rate, but man, if you even get one introduction out of this person, you're ahead of the game. Now, if the meeting went well and this person seems really interested, summarize everything you heard. Hey, Mr. Customer, I heard you say that you have this problems. You have these alternative solutions that are challenging for these reasons. And these are the features that you're actually pretty excited about. And if we were to build that and deliver that, you'd be willing to pay something in the order of X. And then check to see that you got it right. And then propose a follow-on conversation. Now, depending on where your product is, that follow-on conversation might be something as simple as, hey, I'd like to talk to you about being a pilot for my product. Would you be interested? Yes, let's set up another meeting to really talk through how the product works. Let me demo it for you. And let's really just get deeper into what you're working on and how we might be a fit. If your product's super early, you don't have anything yet, you're not ready really for pilots, maybe propose, a whiteboarding session with them to maybe have them influence, your roadmap. Hey, I'd love to get a little bit more detail from your team around how they might want this to work, so that when we build it, we're building it with your use case in mind. Either way, what you want is you want to deepen the conversation and deepen the engagement, moving them forward closer to eventually adopting the product once you have it available. So I know this has only been a 40-minute presentation, but I assure you, this is enough for you to start. The thing about sales is that it's not rocket science. It's just really hard work. And most more than anything, it's just emotionally hard work. But this is a good starting point for anybody to start trying to get out in front of customers, get feedback, and try and line up early sets of customers. Ideally, you know who your champions are. You know how to build a list now. Hopefully, you've got enough to try and build a good enough outreach message, and you now know how to run that first phone call. So my advice is, if you have an idea and you're excited about it, immediately start getting out there and practice. And you'll find that as you go through, so you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to find yourself iterating very, very fast. If you have conviction around a company and a startup, my challenge to you is to get at least 50 customer conversations before you commit to raising money and hiring people and quitting your jobs. So that's it for me. I'd love to open up the Q&A.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, let's start with a question that came into my head. When should you hire your first salesperson?
That's a great question. I get this question often, in particular, right after people have raised a round of financing. It's two people and a dog, and all of a sudden they've got a few $1 million in the bank. And they're like, oh, let's hire a salesperson. And my answer to them is like, whoa, no, do not do that. You got to stop. The thing about salespeople, even the very best salespeople, they're very good at running a playbook. And so you typically don't want to bring on a salesperson until you have a playbook that's working well enough. Because otherwise they're going to show up, they're going to look to you for a playbook you're not going to know. You're going to look back at them and be like, wait, that's your job. And they're like, I've never done that. And then they're going to bumble around for a few months. They're not going to hit quota, and they're going to quit. And that can be very problematic for a startup. So my advice is founders should go try and get their first 5 customers themselves. In that process, they will have learned what worked and what didn't work and what were the gotchas. And then they'll have a playbook, even if they didn't write it down. But there'll be enough there that if a salesperson shows up, that salesperson can at least look at what already worked and effectively and infer a playbook.
Thanks. Makes a lot of sense. What do you feel the key hook is in these email messages that you mentioned earlier in your presentation?
Yeah, let me go back really quick so I can give myself a cheat sheet. So, look, I mean, it really depends. I mean, the two hooks that are implicit in the examples that I give are ultimately, one hook is the product itself, right? Like a hook is, hey, I'm building this thing that you might think is really interesting because I have a high suspicion that you are experiencing this problem. So a good example is a Cobbler.io, right? This company, like there's a reason why they phrased it this way. Through all of their customer discovery, they found that budget variance is a pain point for finance and planning people. And so that's the hook. It's like, oh, budget variance, that's a pain in the ass. I'm going to go talk to you and see what you're working on. I have opinions. For me, when I was starting Stormpath, I didn't actually know what that pain point was at first. And so I made it more about me. Hey, I'm a Stanford student. Most people would love to talk to a student. And so you tell people you're a UW student, like, yeah, most people, especially in the Northwest, are going to be, are more likely than not to give you the time because they want to help you.
Thanks. How do you feel about online marketing platforms like Facebook, Google Ads, Instagram, and so forth? Do you believe that they can circumvent the heavy lifting of finding interested clients and businesses?
That's a great question. I love that question. I don't know. So the difference is those are good for marketing. They're not good for outreach. Those are two very different activities. And so because Facebook and everything is really passive, right? What's the ad you're going to serve somebody, right? Hey, two students, want to build Uber for cats. Come give us a feedback session. Like that's just like the people you really want to talk to are unlikely to click on that ad. And the targeting probably won't be anywhere near as dialed in as you need it to be at these stages. So, and the other thing is it costs money. Right? It costs money and it takes time to build ads that work, right? That's a whole. So I don't know that I would spend that time and money. I would probably just spend more time doing direct outreach. Now, again, this is specific to B2B relationships and interactions like this. If you're talking about a company that's going to be your customer or your partner, I would focus on outreach. If your customers are potentially consumers, that's a different equation. There, it might make a bit more sense, but I don't know enough about that space.
Great, thanks. In the chat, somebody is interested in hearing your advice on how to overcome a mindset where folks don't often see technology as a solution to their problems.
Yeah,
I believe in specifically healthcare.
Yeah. So funny fact, my first startup ever was in healthcare. I started a radiology as a service. I was the founding engineer of a radiology as a service company. So I've experienced this pain firsthand. In fact, we ran into this so much that company didn't work out. Here's my position. My opinion in sales is that it's not about convincing people to buy something. I would argue that I have very rarely convinced anyone to buy anything. What I think sales is about is being ruthlessly prioritizing the search of people who want to buy something, and then doing everything in your power to get them over the line with your product. And so if someone's just not interested in tech, stop talking to them. Go find the people who are. This is part of the reason why in many of the startup books, people will talk about early adopters. So in the healthcare scenario, yeah, there's a bunch of doctors who don't care, right? It's not a high priority for them. They don't want to deal with new tech. There's not going to be your first customers. There's nothing you're going to say or do to convince them. But there might be, a doctor who, for whatever reason, is very pro technology. Go spend your efforts finding that person and getting them to be your early adopter. And if you can't find that person, then that might be a signal that you've got a market problem for your product.
Thanks. Well, we covered your first part, your first career. I think this question relates more to your current career. Is it common for potential investors to say, talk to 50 potential customers or get your first 5 customers, then talk to me? Is it really legitimate to come back to them with these findings?
So I think it's very rare for a VC to give the entrepreneur that feedback. Though I wish it were more common because it is like very productive feedback. Now you might hear code that is implying that, I hear VC, oh, it's a little too early. I wish you'd had a bit, maybe a little bit more work done on the market. I don't know that VCs will be as specific or as crisp on go talk to 50 customers. But I do think it's reasonable. If somebody says, oh, it's too early, I think it's perfectly reasonable to come back to them and be like, hey, you know what? I talked to 50 customers and here's what I learned. We have made investments many times where the first time we talked to the company, it was too early. And we were like, hey, you haven't talked to enough customers. We call it first party conversations, right? You haven't had enough first party conversations. Go talk to a bunch more people and then come back to me with your synthesis of that and seeing if your idea still holds water. And we've had many occasions where the entrepreneurs come back and be like, hey, we did that. We learned a ton. We're no longer building that product. We're instead building this product. And here's why. And then we funded that.
Great. I'm playing off of that. Let's say that you're talking to a customer and they love your product and the price, but don't think you can deliver. All they see is a recent graduate, but not a big enough team. How do you provide confidence to that customer?
That's a good question. Man, that's a complicated one. Look, it depends, right? Like there's a gradient. You going into Boeing and telling them that you're going to, give them this amazing autonomous flight software. You're never going to convince them that, that you're going to deliver it. It's too high risk for them. It's too expensive. But, if you're building, something that's low risk for the customer, you might not need them to really take much of a risk. So you can say things like, well, look, why don't we pilot for free? And, you guys can play with the product as it's being built. And then you guys can decide if it works, once we get there. Let's just keep talking and no commitments until we're ready. Or if it's not about that, you might say, well, look, why don't we scope down the implementation instead of rolling this out, for all your locations? Why don't we just start with this one location so that you, Mr. Customer, are not taking a big risk? Because it ultimately just comes down to the customer not wanting to take personal risk because they don't want to get fired. So understand the scope of the risk they're worried about and see how you might, mitigate it either through limited commitment or limited scope. Or if there's no choice, then you got to move on.
Great. You mentioned earlier finding impassioned people, early adopters specifically. Tips on how to find early adopters, that kind of grouping?
You just got to call them. You get on the phone. I'd love to give you some sense of demographic. I love to tell you, oh, it's engineers from top schools between these ages. I just haven't found that to be true. And it might be, but I have found early adopters everywhere, in large companies and small companies and medium-sized companies, young people, older people. You just got to get in front of your target champion, the people who are feeling the most pain, and see who bites and who doesn't. I personally believe that your most likely early adopters are the people who are feeling the pain most acutely. And so if there's a way for you to dial into that demographic in some way, if you can search for that in some way, then that's like the one thing you might search for.
Great. If your target customer is a consumer, how does this approach change?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting. I think in the early days of your idea, I think we should still start with this. Now, when you're talking to a handful of people, just to really top level get a sense of whether or not you're delivering value. The problem with consumer versus a business, or what people call enterprise, is that organizations, because there are multiple people in a transaction and because a transaction tends to be pretty expensive, they don't have impulse purchases. And they tend to be less price sensitive than consumers. And so as a result, organizations tend to be much more rational in their purchase decisions. You know, if you can show a high return on investment with a low payback period, and it's a high enough priority, you can pretty much predict that an organization is going to buy the product. A consumer is fickle, right? You know, they impulse buy. You know, why did they buy like this particular Nike? Why are people spending $30,000 on an NFT? Right? Like there's no ROI. There's no like critical need that they woke up with that morning. They just decided they wanted it. And so with customers, I think it's good to understand the drivers, the rational drivers, but it's hard to account for the irrational drivers. And so that's where people start doing smoke tests or A/B tests. There are all kinds of other mechanisms people use to try and get a sense for consumer demand. I'm not an expert in that, but I would say it's a pretty heavily researched and written about topic online.
Great. Thanks for bringing on NFTs. It's not a solid week without that coming up. And I'll ask a question for the startups that work in CoMotion Labs, Blue Call. When you're discussing this, how does this apply to life sciences where you're trying to partner with a big biotech company?
Yeah, that's a good question. So look, I mean, in biotech, in particular in the therapeutic side of biotech or the drug discovery side of biotech, the Pfizers of the world, yeah, like they're quasi customers, right? You're really more trying to partner with them in the development of something. And that's also true for many other types of businesses where maybe your go-to-market is more partner-based as opposed to selling to a customer. I would say that this all still holds quite well because under the hood of everything we talked about is ultimately you're trying to suss out priority. Is this a high priority need for the customer? Partnerships are the exact same problem. If you are solving something that is not a high priority need for Pfizer, they're not going to partner with you, right? If you're solving something that is a high priority need, then they're going to spend the time and resources to work with you. So, the one thing that might be different is, would you pay me for this? That conversation might be slightly different. It might be like, hey, would you give me points of royalty on the drug that we discover? Would you be giving me a multi-million-dollar milestone payments? But that's a bit more inside baseball. But structurally, I don't think it's any different.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for tuning in. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us. And a big thank you for Alex for sharing his wisdom with the group. I really appreciate your analogy to the shoe purchasing earlier as a person sitting next to 6 extra pairs of shoes in his office. As a reminder, next Friday at noon, we'll be hearing from Cassie Binford and Matt Medlin, who will present Roadmap to Scale Financial Reporting. Sign up for that. We'll see you next week, and hopefully we'll see you in person soon. Have a great weekend.